we're going to get right into it today. We're going to be talking about some of the challenges as we get up close to the closing of the exit, of things that can come up like icebergs to the Titanic that could completely derail the deal. But before we even get to that point, let's talk about some of the normal dynamics that just cause choppy waters. We don't want to be dealing with Titanic issues this late in the game. We want to be able to navigate through choppy waters. So as you can see on the slide, we want to be able to drive a very large boat, not just through the storm, but through all the difficulties and challenges to be able to get it into safe harbor and to be able to dock it. And if you have a large business or a business that's large to you, you're going to want the same ability to navigate your business as you would want with the size of boat you're going to be driving. So if you have a couple $100,000, a couple million, a couple tens of millions of dollars in your business, you're going to need the same kind of skill sets to be able to drive the size of a boat that would cost that much. So let's make sure that as you approach the close, you know how to navigate the close, that you've spent enough time educating yourself, not just on what to expect, but what some of the challenges are that could come up, what some of the normal expectations and normal situations are, and then also to be able to understand the people that are involved that could also be influencing the deal. All right, so today we're going to be talking about specifically the terms and conditions of the purchase agreement. And managing our expectations is the biggest aspect of it. So, kind of walking that fine line, the balancing act of running our company at the same time that we're trying to sell it. We can't necessarily live both of those dynamics out in the open. We're trying to be able to keep the exit a little bit quiet. Maybe we haven't told our employees, our spouse probably knows, or our life partner, our business partners probably know. But other than that, we've got to run the business and keep running the business as if this exit could never happen, right? And so as we're doing that, it feels in business that something could come from out of the blue and just knock you right off of your tightrope. So deep breath. My desire is to be able to give you enough information and education that you know how to handle not just the tightrope, but all the crazy stuff that can come from behind you and blindside you. All right, let's talk about three things today: representations or reps, warranties, and indemnifications. Those three aspects are going to be the big plays at the end of negotiating and closing your exit. First off, let's talk about what the reps are. Reps are representations of what I said the business was. I made representations at two phases of selling my company. One was right up front before they ever put the letter of interest in. I made certain representations that the company's doing X revenue with X profitability, with X customers, et cetera, et cetera. And then once the letter of intent is done, then the buyer gets to come in during due diligence and verify everything that I represented. And they're looking at my business and my enterprise with their own set of eyes. So if I promise them a nice big fat salmon like what you see here, I'd better not let them discover that it's actually a dead fish washed up and of nothing value, right? So during due diligence, whatever we represented up front is going to get either verified during due diligence, or it's going to get found out during due diligence that it may be slightly different than the way I presented it. And therefore we're going to have to negotiate the dynamics, or we're going to have to be able to agree to disagree. So why does this impact the closing? After due diligence, the buyer has the freedom to be able to negotiate terms of the deal based on what they discovered during the due diligence. So as they finish the actual purchase and sales agreement, the actual legal documents, they're trying to write down in legalese the verification of what I as the buyer represented to them. And so that document, the purchase and sales agreement in the reps or representations, is legally confirming that I am representing the company as I presented during the LOI and during due diligence. And that once they actually sign the dotted line and actually own the company, all of the reps and representations that I made are still true once they actually own it. Okay? All right, so now let's talk about warranties. So warranties are saying that nothing's going to break. Just like with your regular car, you're saying that the brakes work, the windshield works, the windshield wipers, etc., etc. Now they can only see it from a distance during the LOI phase. They can only see it as good as they can when they've opened up the door during due diligence and they've looked inside all the closets. That's the best that they can see, that the brakes work, etc. But unlike a car, buyers can't take my company for a test drive. They really don't know that it's really functioning until they actually take the keys and they've actually bought it and are running it themselves. So in the warranty section of the purchase and sales agreement, we're verifying that it's not going to have the brakes go out and wrap itself around the proverbial phone pole, right? So this is where indemnification comes into play. Indemnification is basically saying that all of the aspects of the warranties are dealt with in the warranties. Anything outside the scope of what I guaranteed was functioning are things that I can't control, right? So warranties are things that I could control as the seller, and I'm warranting that they're in place, whereas indemnifications are all the other things that could go wrong. So the purchase and sales agreement is going to define what it is that I'm warranting or guaranteeing is functioning about the business when I sell it and on the day of closing. Indemnifications are being written down as the potential scenarios, the dynamics that something from out of the blue could happen. Now, the dynamic here in this picture is the buyer a couple months down the road, 6 months, a year later after buying the company, it may have something happen to the business in a negative sense, and they're really upset about it, and they are pointing the blame back at me as the seller that I did something wrong and I'm gonna have to pay for it, or something isn't meeting their revenue expectations, or some customer quit on them, and they're pointing the finger at me saying, hey, Brian, you're at fault for this, and you're gonna have to pay us and compensate us for some problem. Well, the good thing about your purchase and sales agreement, that if you wrote the warranties correctly, then you're going to have the rule of law being able to back you up and saying, I am not responsible. That's a dynamic that you have to deal with on your own at your own expense. So the indemnifications are legal protection for you as the seller against accusations from the buyer after they've bought the business, okay? Now, let's keep our eye on the ball, right? We have to remember during the negotiation and the back and forth with the purchase and sales agreement that the end result is what we're trying to get to. So whenever the buyer is challenging us about something in the reps or the warranties or the indemnification, sure, we can push back on it, we negotiate it, but the key is not to get so emotionally upset that we blow up the deal over something that could have been resolved. Because if we don't do the exit, we're never going to get the cash payout, we're never going to get the dollar value for the business, we're never going to have the time and the freedom to go do what we want to do. So as all of this back and forth starts happening between due diligence and the day of closing, just be patient, and I always recommend keep your eye on the ball of what you really want to do. Now let's talk about the different parties involved and the expectations about their involvement and your interaction with them. So there's going to be a number of people, not just on your side of the fence, but on their side of the fence too. You'll have your legal team, right? So whoever it is that's representing you, they're going to have to interact with the legal team on the buy side. And it may be that you have a $5, $10, $30, $100 million company that's doing the acquisition, and so their legal team may have 1, 2, or 3 lawyers. But on your side of the fence, you've got 1 or 2 maybe at the most. So all of the people involved here could wind up taking a long time cycle to deal with any kind of issue that comes up. And so if my lawyer is not seeing eye to eye with their lawyer about how to word something to match the intent of the 2 parties, then that buy-side lawyer is going to have to go interact with the investment banker and go and interact with the buyer's team, potentially the board of directors, etc. And that whole communication cycle could take quite a long time. Consider if they have a monthly or a quarterly board meeting where they have to review large impact decisions. So if your acquisition is a large impact decision and they only meet every month, then you could wind up having a month delay in order for that board to deal with an issue that's going to get resolved inside the purchase and sales agreement. If you don't want to have coverage on indemnification for something and they don't want it, then all of that back and forth can cause a lot of time. And of course, as the seller, I want to get to the exit. I want to get to that day of closing, sign in the line, and get my money in my bank. So for me, having to wait a month for their board can be very, very frustrating. Now, ideally, we're going to have a situation where their lawyer is interacting with my lawyer, and they can deal with paragraphs and sentences, and they are able to communicate easily to be able to get to the intent of the letter of intent and the negotiated deals and terms. So if they're able to do that, great. If they're both motivated to bill as many hours as possible, then that could create a challenge because they could wind up taking way too long just for their own personal gain. So as the seller, I've got to make sure that my legal team is getting things moving along at a good pace with their legal team, and they're not wasting hours going back and forth, etc. You want a real good, tight communication loop between the two legal teams. And then I need to be really good with my legal team to be able to take their questions, spin it around, do the what ifs, what about this, option A, option B, and then make a decision so that my legal team can go back to the table with the other legal team and get the ball moving forward, right? So as fast as I can turn something in 1 or 2 or 3 days, depending on when I can get to my lawyer and he can get to me, recognize on the buy side, that team may have more people involved in that decision loop whenever there has to be input. So 1 to 3 days on my side, it may be 1 day to 1 month on their side, and that's just a dynamic that's involved. So to be patient, take a deep breath, and just understand that those influences are happening to the timeline. Now, ideally, you have some dynamics inside the negotiation to be able to move the ball forward and incentivize them to do that. Time can kill deals, and so you and your team want to make sure that they and their team are not languishing somewhere for some issue. All right, so that brings me to close on helping you understand the impact of warranties and reps and indemnifications on the purchase and sales agreement in between the timeline of the due diligence and the day of closing. And hopefully now you're going to be able to sit back and relax a little bit and just know that that's what some of the things are that you're going to have to navigate through so that you and your banker or broker are able to get it done and get to that day of closing without a lot of hassle.